In this tutorial, you're going to learn how to split a guy's head in half to reveal his inner self. Because as everyone knows, beneath every human suit is a beautiful, luminous spirit. And that's what we're going to capture in our photo manipulation today. We're going to go over masks and curves and blending modes, and there's a lot of good stuff in this one, so you're going to want to stay tuned to the end so you can carry these techniques into any sort of photo manipulation project that you might have in the future. So let's get started. With our portrait open, the first thing that we want to do is unlock the background layer. You can do that just by clicking the little lock button. Then we're going to duplicate that layer by hitting Control or Command J. Once we have that layer duplicated, we're going to select his head with the Object Selection tool. Draw a little box around his head. Now with this selection, we're going to create a mask. Come down here to Create New Mask, and if you hit the little backslash button, you'll see that's what we have masked out. Hit Control or Command, click on the mask thumbnail, and come up here to Select, Save Selection. And we're going to call this Head. Let's hit Enter. And that will save the selection so we can use it for later. Call this layer Top Head. Grab an elliptical marquee tool, or you can just hit M. Draw an oval right below his eyes and have it extend to the middle of his ears and all the way down below his neck. With your mask selected, come up here to Edit, Fill, and fill it with black. Now if you hide the background layer, you'll see that we just have the top of his head. Duplicate the top head layer and click on the mask and hit Control or Command I to invert that mask. And now if you deselect both of these layers beneath it, you'll see that we have everything but the top head. But we want to actually have only the bottom of the head. So this is where we will bring back in that selection that we saved earlier. So with top head copy selected, which we're actually going to call this bottom head, not top head copy. With that selected, with the mask selected, come back up to Select, Load Selection, go to Channel, Head, say OK, and we load back up that selection. Now if you just hit Control-Shift-I, it will select everything outside of that selection. And again, we're going to come up here to Edit, Fill, and we're going to fill it all with black. Turn off both the layers below it again. We'll see that now we just have the bottom of his head. But if you notice that it left some little bits that we actually don't want. So let's go ahead and just with our brush tool delete those guys because we don't want all that. That's nonsense. All right, turn everything back on. Now turn off the bottom and top head layers. Now we just have our background layer. Draw with your lasso tool, just hit L and draw like just a rough selection around his head. We're just gonna remove this head so that doesn't get in the way later. So with that lasso selection, come up here to Edit, Content Aware Fill. And now Photoshop is gonna fill that portion with the parts that it thinks you want it to be filled with. But we're going to go ahead and deselect just by drawing on it all of his jacket and anything that we don't want Photoshop to think will go in that part of his head. Well, that looks pretty good. Say okay. Control or Command D to deselect that. And this is going to be head fill. That's what I'm going to call that layer. Head fill. Now go ahead and select, turn your top and bottom head back on and select the top head layer and hit Control or Command T to move it up. I hold Shift while I move it just so that it stays like on one axis. Underneath this top head layer, let's go ahead and create a new layer. And in this layer, we are going to create like a little bit of a shadow for underneath his head. So for that, we're going to use the elliptical marquee tool again. Go ahead and select it and zoom on in here. Draw an ellipse that looks roundabout what you think underneath the shadow of his head would look like. Hit G for gradient. I honestly can't even tell you how to get to it. Oh, it's over here in the corner. G for gradient. Come up to your gradient settings up here in the top left and click this little guy and select the darkest color you can find on this guy. For some reason, it doesn't get as dark as I want it, so I'm gonna double click on this little doohickey and bring it down darker because I want it to be pretty dark. And then on this other little tab, make sure the opacity is at 100. The opacity you set just by clicking on the little top guy. The bottom one will be the color. Grab like a lighter color from this guy and say okay. Click and drag out. Actually, I think I did it from like down here. Now that we have the shadow for the top of the head, let's go ahead and bring in our muscle man. I'm gonna scale him down just a little bit, obviously, and line him up. Now the nose isn't going to be aligned perfectly, and I have had to come to grips with that's just the way it is. Just align his ears, adjust it and scale it as needed until it looks right to you. Hit enter, and now with your muscle man layer selected, come down to create new mask, and on that mask with our brush tool, we're just going to paint. Gosh dang it, we're just gonna paint black on everything that we don't want sticking out. And I just realized that this part of my head fill layer was blocking out some important parts of my man. So I'm filling him back in by just erasing on that head fill layer the parts that were covering up his shoulders. Whoopsie daisy. We're gonna call that gradient underneath his head, we're gonna call it inside head. Go back to your muscle man, Control or Command J to duplicate him, and come up here to filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and set it to about 5. Say okay, and set the opacity of the layer to 50%. Set the blending mode to screen. Duplicate it once more, double click on the Gaussian blur effect, and set it to a blur of 15. Set the opacity to 30%. Control or Command J to duplicate that layer one last time. Double click on the Gaussian blur and set the blur to 30. Set the opacity on this layer to 20%. And what I'm gonna do here to bring back some detail into our muscle man face, go back down to the original muscle man layer, Control or Command J to duplicate it, and bring that duplicated layer all the way to the top. Set the blending mode on that layer to overlay. Now select all of your muscle man layers. Come down here to this little folder icon, click it, and that's going to group it all together. Muscle man, muscle man. Now we're going to bring in our eyeball, our third eye. I'm gonna bring it all the way to the top so I can work with it here. I'm gonna grab my lasso tool, or you can just hit L. I'm gonna draw around the eye, the bits that I want. Come down here to create a mask. Now let's come to Image, Adjustments, and set it to black and white. And let's scale it down so that it looks like a proper third eye. And now obviously we're just gonna wanna clean up that mask so it's not so sharp. I like to leave some of the eyelid and the little wrinkles underneath just to keep it looking realistic. Let's name it third eye. Set the blending mode to linear light. I'm gonna scale mine just a little more and move it up just a little bit. Duplicate your third eye layer and add an unsharp mask. So you come up here to Filter, Sharpen, Unsharp Mask. Set the amount to 150 and the radius to 0.5. Come back to Filter, Other, and add a high pass. Set the high pass to 50 and say okay. Set the opacity on this layer to 50%. Now let's drop in a lens flare. Lens flares make everything cooler and they make everything look more spiritual. Right away, I'm gonna set the blending mode to screen so that I can see beneath it. I'm gonna hit Control or Command T, and I'm gonna scale it so that the top of it is right on the top of this guy's head. Hit Enter once you have it where you like it. Mask out the edges of the top to make it look like hard edges. And then we're also gonna mask out in front of him on his shoulders and whatnot. I'm also gonna mask out the little part in front of the third eye. Now let's drop in our caustics image, which is just some caustics from the bottom of a pool. And this is gonna make it look really cool. So hit Control or Command T, scale it first down in front of his head like that. Set the blending mode to screen. Draw like a circle around his head and make a mask of that. Double click on the mask. Bring the feather up to 50. And now just paint on the parts that are covering up his face. Now let's bring in a glow. And this will be for the third eye. Go ahead and set it right away to screen. Scale it down right in front of the eye. Hit Enter, create a mask, and then paint out the part that is covering up the eye. Now above the background layer, the very bottom layer, we're going to drop in some geometry. Hit Enter when you bring it in. Now the one that I've provided for you guys, if you're following along with me, is black geometry on a white background, but we actually want to invert that. So go ahead and just hit Control or Command I on that layer and then set the blending mode to screen. I'm actually gonna bring it above the head fill because I just noticed that the head fill is covering it up. And we don't want that. Scale it down a little bit. Again, a mask, and we're just gonna paint out the parts that cover his neck and shoulders. Now come up to the very top layer, and right above that layer, we're going to drop a curves adjustment layer. Bring the input to about 84, and the output, let's bring that to about 22. And on that curves adjustment layer mask, we're just gonna paint out with our brush tool, the glowing man, so that he glows even more. Just like that. Doop. And there you have it. Got your super spiritual vintage glowing man. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you learned a lot from this and that you feel more confident in your photo manipulation skills after this. Stay tuned for more and feel free to reach out if you have any questions. And I'll see you next time.